Good morning. And how are you all this morning on a beautiful Saturday, spring day? Excited to be here? Yes. Are you? Yes. Okay. All right, let's acknowledge a few things. First and foremost, one, thank you for being here. This is a vital and crucial ministry to our discipleship. I also want to acknowledge that this is a very difficult thing to show up to and to be part of. Talking about death and what comes after your death. There's nothing easy about it. Third, for those of you who are online, thank you for joining us from wherever you are. I want to let you know, those of you at home, that we have packets for you that include both a burial worksheet for planning through your funeral, as well as a document from the Episcopal Church Foundation that has everything in it that you could possibly need and want about wills, about estates, about funeral homes, about planning your funeral. Really, really important information. But before we begin and introduce our presenters and spend a little time talking about the importance of this ministry, what do you say we pray? The Lord be with you. Gracious God, we give you thanks that death isn't the end. We give you thanks for a village of people who will walk with us as we make these difficult decisions and have these difficult conversations. We thank you for loving us through it all, for giving us the opportunity to be a community of faith that witnesses to the resurrection even beyond the grave. We ask you to bless us as we discern, as we gain knowledge and insight and wisdom. What is your will for our lives and for our deaths? Knowing that life doesn't end, it simply changes. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Friends, this is a spiritual component to our lives, right? Question, why do we do funerals in the Episcopal Church? Anyone know? What do you got? Fran? To comfort the people living, correct? Yeah? Why else? Because the clergy like them? We do. We do. Getting to proclaim resurrection is one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given, even in the midst of grief and tragedy. Yeah. To celebrate the life of the person who died. You know, in our prayer book, there's a great paragraph that talks about the purpose of funerals. And it's not that we shouldn't grieve. Even Jesus grieved and cried at the friend Lazarus when Lazarus died. But it's also a celebration because we believe in hope after death and resurrection. So you hold those two tensions in both hands, right? The grief and the celebration. Why else? Why else do a funeral? I mean, what do you care? You're dead. Right? Why do a funeral? Why do we do these liturgical acts? Yes. It is a witness to what we believe. Our faith transcends time. And as Christians, we believe, yet again, that death doesn't have the final answer. And our funerals, our celebrations of life, the memorial services we have, whatever your service looks like, is a witness to what we believe and a witness to who Jesus Christ is in our lives and in our deaths and then in our lives again. So incredibly important. Now, a few things I want you to know about the importance of this. Age is not a factor. You saw in my letter, at 27 years old, the widowmaker came knocking, and I refused to answer, but I very easily could have. By the grace of God, I didn't have to put my husband through figuring out what kind of service I would want. Death can come at any point. COVID-19 has proven that, yes? We've all had loss. The other thing is grief, manifests itself in so many ways. I don't know how many times I've sat in a hospital with a family who's grieving the loss of a loved one who died, whether expectedly or unexpectedly, and had no idea what to do next. You have no idea what grief is going to do to you in those moments. So planning and preparing for what comes next is a gift given. It's a way of saying, I love you even beyond this tragic event, even beyond this transition. So we plan. We do it now because the time is of the essence, right? The time is now. I have an incredible group of presenters here today. I'm so thankful. When you were born, you weren't born alone out in a field somewhere, correct? You had a village of people that helped bring you into life. The same should be true of when we die. There is a village of people that walks with us. That includes clergy, it includes attorneys and people who know the law and all of the estate planning and will making. It includes funeral directors and those who know the nuts and bolts and the pastoral care of walking with the family. So this is an example of your village on this particular day. We have Jeremy DeBoard with DeBoard Snyder Funeral Home. I have to be honest, I've worked with Jeremy quite a bit in my short tenure, and I love him. And I love the ministry that he does in Lancaster. I'm not trying to push his funeral home. Yes, I am. I love him. All right? We got Brad Zook, attorney. We have Penn Glazier, an attorney. These guys are the people I'll be going to, whether they like it or not, when John and I decide, we haven't updated our wills since we had a second kid. Another important factor to remember. Life changes, so should our plans. I'm not the same Christian I was when I was 27. I don't even like half of those hymns anymore. So those things need to change as we grow and as we experience life. So this is not a once and done thing. This is a ministry that will evolve just as your faith and your relationships and your families will evolve. And then we also have Matt, our associate rector, who has his fair share of experiences with walking with people through this. Now, for those of you who aren't here present or will be seeing this stream days later, I want to extend an invitation, not just to you all, but everyone. If you at any point would like to sit down with me and plan your service or talk about questions you may have, I would love nothing more. It is a privilege, an honor, one of the most profound experiences I have as a priest to take part in that type of ministry. So my door physically is always open, but is always open for you all at any point if you want to schedule a time so that we can talk about these things and get things on record and on file. Amen? I feel like I'm preaching a little bit this morning. Good thing I don't have to preach tomorrow. I want to hand things over to Jeremy, who's going to talk to you a little bit about his part of this ministry. And again, I love him. So, Jeremy, you're up.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Can everybody hear me? Testing. Yes. Okay, excellent. No? How about now? Testing. Better, thank you. Well, thank you, Amanda. I certainly appreciate your kind words and promotional plug. I appreciate that very much. So again, I'm Jeremy DeBoard. I'm a licensed funeral director and the fourth generation owner of DeBoard Snyder Funeral Home. Just quickly, we have two locations, one on East Orange Street, one on Marietta Avenue, family owned and operated, and we have been for 4 generations. So we're very proud of our history and heritage within Lancaster. As Amanda mentioned, as difficult of a topic as this is, I think it's absolutely imperative for you to have at least some general knowledge of what goes on in our industry, but more specifically, what service options you have. So I do want to touch on what options you have when you pass away. Now, as important as it is to understand what options you have, it's just as important, if not more important, to take that knowledge of what's available and decide what's right for you, and to convey that information to your loved ones, to your clergy, and then to a funeral home. And that, of course, is what we consider pre-planning. So I'm going to touch on pre-planning as well. I'm also going to finish with some tips and recommendations I recommend considering when choosing a funeral home. Just like any other industry, doctors, attorneys, not all funeral homes are created equally. They are different, and it's important that you know sort of the pros and cons of each to determine what's right for you. So before I jump into service options, I'm going to read word for word because I do feel it's very important, and ironically enough, Amanda, it's the importance of a funeral. What is the point? Funerals provide family members and friends a caring and supportive environment in which to share thoughts and feelings about a loved one. It's the first step in the healing process, and it's an opportunity to laugh, cry, grieve, and say a final goodbye. So by a show of hands, and don't be bashful, please, who has ever heard somebody say, when I pass away, I don't want a funeral, I don't want a service, don't fuss over me? A few hands, a lot of hands, a few smiles. And maybe you've said that yourself. And if you have, that's truly your wish to not have any type of memorialization. I respect your opinion. However, my objective is not necessarily to change your mind, but talk to your loved ones. Talk to your friends, talk to your children, your family. What do they need to grieve? There's a saying in our industry that funerals are for the living. They're not for the dead. So I encourage you to really give that some thought as far as what your family needs, your loved ones need to grieve your loss. So as far as service options today, there's really two main options. One would be a traditional casketed burial, and the other is cremation. Now, technically, there's a third option, that's body donation. You can donate your body to science. None of these I'm going to go into great detail, but I will have some time for a question and answer session at the end. And again, even offline, I'm happy to answer any questions for you. One of the points I want to make, regardless if burial or cremation is selected, the exact same service options are available to you. So what do I mean by that? The body can still be embalmed, laid out for a viewing, followed by a funeral, whether it's at the church, a retirement home, funeral home, or some other venue. The same hymns, the same readings, the same eulogy, the same order of worship is possible regardless of if burial or cremation is selected. The biggest difference is if cremation is selected, the body would be taken to the crematory following the funeral. If burial is selected, we would go to the cemetery. Now, do you have to have a viewing or a funeral if cremation is selected? No, absolutely not. But I like to make it clear to families, I'm oftentimes really confused and surprised how many people say, boy, Mom always wanted cremation, but I really wish we could have a viewing. The grandkids who live out in California haven't seen her in over 2 years, and they're surprised to know that is possible. So a viewing, a funeral, all those things are certainly possible regardless if cremation or burial is selected. So keep that in mind. When it comes to burial, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I think most of us know what it is. But again, the body is oftentimes embalmed, placed in the casket for a viewing and a funeral, and then, of course, taken to the cemetery for in-ground burial or burial above ground in a mausoleum. By a show of hands, who says embalming of a body is required by law? Who says yes? Okay, so the answer is no. The body is not required to be embalmed. If you're planning on having a viewing to say your goodbyes, I'd highly recommend it. But again, it's not required, and if you're told it's required, that's not true. So it's important to know what's legally required and what is not. By another show of hands, well, I want to talk briefly about a burial vault. A vault is that concrete device that goes in the ground at the cemetery that the casket is lowered into. By a show of hands, who says burial vaults are required by law? Okay. About 30% of you. Believe it or not, the answer is no. They're not required by law. However, the law states each individual cemetery can set their own policies, procedures, rules, and regulations. And I will tell you about 90%, 95% of cemeteries here in Lancaster require a burial vault. So I'll touch briefly about green burials. Green burials, for those of you who don't know, has been sort of a buzzword over the years, but hasn't taken on popularity here in Lancaster as it has on the West Coast. A green burial is a very naturalistic approach where the body oftentimes is not embalmed or embalmed using eco-friendly preservatives. The body is then placed inside a biodegradable casket, oftentimes bamboo or another biodegradable material, and then lowered into the ground for burial. I have families that come to me and say, Jeremy, I really want to take the green approach and have a green burial. I have a plot down at XYZ cemetery. What do we need to do to make that happen? And I have to break the news to them. I can provide a green burial up until the burial itself, because XYZ cemetery requires a burial vault. As soon as a concrete device goes into the ground, it's no longer green. Now, any good funeral home can make recommendations as far as cemeteries that don't require vaults. There's not many in Lancaster, but to have a truly green burial, you can't have a burial vault. And again, most cemeteries do require that. Okay. Moving on regarding cremation, again, most of us understand the general concept, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but I do want to make it clear that a viewing is possible. In fact, I'd recommend it. I tell all the families that I work with, you may want to consider having a viewing before the cremation to really say your goodbyes, and some families need that for closure. I don't charge any more for that, just so you know. I think it's a part of the grieving process. Not all families need it, but some families do. So you'll want to consider that. Again, I find great value in viewing my loved one in a peaceful state to say my goodbyes. But again, every family is different. So you'll want to think about that, whether you want a viewing prior to cremation. Some families choose to have a memorial service. Of course, memorial, meaning the body is not present, in memory, and that's often represented by the urn being present, a flower arrangement, a photograph, any other type of memorabilia that helps tell that loved one's story. Again, that could take place here at the church or some other venue. The biggest difference with cremation is what can happen, what are your options when it comes to your cremated remains. Some families bury or inter at the cemetery. Some retain. I have families that have passed urns down from generation to generation. I have families that scatter, or families that do a combination of all of them, where they may bury the majority of mom's cremated remains at the cemetery and retain a portion for scattering or to pass down from generation to generation. By a show of hands, who says scattering of cremated remains is legal? Who says yes, it is? About half, okay. The answer is it depends. If it's done on private property, of course, you're absolutely welcome to do so. If it's done at sea, you're supposed to get a permit, and any good funeral director can help you do that. But the laws, and I'm looking at my attorney friends here, it's sort of gray. It states as long as you're not creating a nuisance, scattering of cremated remains is permissible. So what's considered a nuisance, I guess that's up for interpretation. But nevertheless, I tell families, if you're going to do so, use common sense, be dignified about it, and you won't have an issue. Am I okay on time? Okay. The last option is body donation. You do have the option of donating your body to science for medical research. Now, there's a few very important takeaways that I want to make clear. A viewing of the body is not possible if you go this route. We must transport the body to medical research ASAP. So that takes away the opportunity to have a viewing. So if you're adamant on having a viewing for your family to say your final goodbyes, I'd highly recommend not going this route. After the medical research concludes, your body will ultimately be cremated and returned to your family. That can take up to 2 years. Now, Humanity Gift Registry, which is the organization we work with, is very reputable. They do a wonderful job. I don't know if it's always properly conveyed to the families that it can take up to 2 years to receive your cremated remains. I've had a family not that long ago that say, Jeremy, we're going to donate mom's body to medical research, And then we're going to have a memorial service and burial in about 2 weeks when we get the cremated remains back. And I said, folks, let's back up for a minute. And they were really taken back. To some families, that's okay. 2 years, 3 years, there's no hurry. But I want to make that very clear to families. It can take up to 2 years to get your cremated remains back. And then lastly, contrary to popular belief, body donation is not free. There's charges to bring your body into our care from the place of death. All the necessary legal paperwork must be done, Social Security notifications, filing the death certificate, all the necessary permits. The same paperwork is done with body donation as opposed to, or compared to cremation. So again, contrary to popular belief, body donation is not free of cost. Just to keep that in mind as well. But you can have a memorial service as well, and I would encourage you to think about that if you go the route of body donation. So thinking ahead, I'm talking about pre-planning. What you're doing now is pre-planning. You're becoming informed consumers, you're getting some ideas, and probably some of you are thinking about what would be right for me. Pre-planning can be done on different levels. Again, what you're doing is pre-planning. The next step is to go home, digest this information, talk to your loved ones, your family, and decide what's right for you. And then convey that information to your clergy, to a funeral director, and get your wishes documented, get them in writing, and stored in a safe place. And that's considered pre-planning. Now, there is the option of prepaying. They're not one and the same. I would encourage each and every one of you to pre-plan, at the very least. Now, I would encourage prepaying as well, but it's not required. There are benefits of prepaying. The one is the psychological benefit, knowing that everything's taken care of. When I pass away, there'll be no financial obligation placed on my children or my loved ones. But more from a practical or more of a financial standpoint, prepaying, not all funeral homes do this, but they have what's considered an inflation-proof plan. We do. I would ask your funeral home of choice, if I pay in full today, in 20, 30 years from now, I pass away, are you going to come back and ask my family for additional funds? If the answer is yes, we will, they don't have an inflation-proof plan. So you'll want to ask that question. Not all funeral homes do. Okay? So a couple things I want to talk about, and again, I'll be brief, but a few tips I recommend when choosing a funeral home. Number one, ask the community. Ask your clergy, ask your friends, ask your family, which funeral home do you use and why? If the answer is a shrug, that's always who we've used for generations, well, maybe that's not the best answer, maybe it is. There has to be a reason. Why? Do you trust them? What makes you choose that specific funeral home? Look at reviews online. Just like any other major purchase, going online, reviewing unbiased reviews of that funeral home will tell you a lot. Number three is my personal favorite, attend a funeral hosted by that particular funeral home. How do they treat the family they're serving? How are you, the guest, treated when you come in? Is it organized? Do they have attention to detail? Did it start on time? All those things are important. Attending a funeral hosted by the specific funeral home of choice will tell a great deal about that funeral home. Number four would be look at their facility. Visit the funeral home. Some of you would say, well, I'm going to have my service here at the church. Why do I care? Regardless, I think they need to have an open door policy. They need to greet you. They need to give you a tour. Is it clean? Is it updated? Are you made to feel welcome? It'll tell you a lot. Go look at their facility and ask for a tour. And finally, ask about their credentials. This may seem obvious, but Jeremy, are you a licensed funeral director? Do you own and operate your own crematory? Are the cremations handled by certified crematory operators? You may be surprised the answers you receive. Ask questions, ask about their credentials. And a few tips when prepaying. As I mentioned, prepaying is not required, but for most people, it makes a lot of financial sense. Make a list of questions to ask before going to the funeral home. Like any other major purchase, buying a car, buying a house, washing machine, I don't know, whatever. But you would come up with questions that you would want to ask prior to going in. Ask what all is covered. Am I paying in full? Is this the bottom line? If I pay you today, will there be additional fees for my family going forward that you're not talking about today? Ask. Here's a great one. Ask what happens if the funeral home goes out of business. The answer should be simple. When you prepay for a funeral, those funds are tied to your Social Security number. It's not my money, it's your money. It doesn't become our funds until we perform the service. That's important. If the funeral home goes out of business, 10 years from now you decide you don't like me anymore, or whatever the case may be. Let's say you move to Florida, you move to California. Are those funds transferable? They need to be. Not all funeral homes allow that. Ask, are my funds transferable? And what happens if you go out of business? Okay. Ensure that 100% of your funds are invested. This may seem obvious, but if the price of the funeral is XYZ, make sure that check that you're writing is for XYZ. They need to match. Ask for copies of everything that you sign. Again, it's all pretty self-explanatory. Use common sense, but again, these are important. Lastly, I'll address the kind of proverbial elephant in the room. Most of us have read in the news, in the newspaper, heard in the news about a local funeral home who were doing some unethical things, okay? A great way to avoid this, when you're writing a check to prepay for your funeral, never write the check to the funeral home. You would never write the check to DeBoard Snyder Funeral Home. You would write the check to the investment vehicle, to the bank, to the insurance company. It's important. That allows, not that I would ever cash your check, but it doesn't give me the opportunity to do so. I'm only able to deposit those funds into the investment vehicle, making sure your funds are safe and secure. It's very important. Ask, and then I want to talk briefly, will you touch on irrevocability and things of that nature? Okay. Will the funds be set up as irrevocable or irrevocable, depending on who's pronouncing it and where you are in the country? But irrevocable means if I prepay for my funeral, those funds are reserved only for funeral expenses and cannot be seized by the nursing home, by the state of Pennsylvania, if and when you apply for Medicaid. Let's face it, skilled care is very costly. I've had very, very wealthy families deplete their funds if, God forbid, they go to skilled care. So if the funds are set up as irrevocable or irrevocable, it means the funds are guaranteed, they're reserved, they're protected only for funeral expenses, and nobody can seize those funds from you. Okay? And then lastly, again, are your prices guaranteed? We talked briefly about that the inflation-proof plan. If I pay you in full, will you come back 10, 20, 30 years from now and ask my family for additional funds? If the answer is yes, the prices are not guaranteed and they don't have an inflation-proof plan. Okay. So I went over a lot, and again, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues here. They can jump in. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end. Again, I'm happy to be a resource to you, regardless if you decide to utilize my funeral home or not. I want to be a resource to you. So if you have questions, call me. I have some literature in the back, again, not in a promotional way, but if you need to touch base with me in any way, I'm happy to answer your questions. Okay? So I'm going to turn it over to...
Yeah.
Sure, yep, that'd be great.
Brad Zook, come on down.
All right, Brad, thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, Rosemary, for setting this up, and Amanda, and all of you for coming out on a beautiful spring morning, sunshiny day to talk about death and dying. It is one of the best times to do it. I always advise clients, don't think about these things late at night right before you go to bed. And as Amanda said, and Jeremy explained too, there's a spiritual component to this, and then there's also sort of a a corporal component to this. I think Jesus was on the steps of the temple when he said, "Give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's." I'm going to talk about the Caesar world that we're living in. And with estate planning and estate administration, it's really two sides. One is the planning side and one's the administration side. With planning, what most people are thinking about are wills, powers of attorney, sometimes trust documents, trust agreements, and things like that. It's important to understand what a will does and doesn't do and what an estate does and doesn't do. And for the most part, what we're talking about is how we transfer assets. The things that we own during our lifetime are ours. We can do whatever we want with them. We can give them away. We can sell them. But when we die, if we own certain things, we need to have a way to transfer them. For my purposes, things that we own during our lifetime fall into three categories. The first is there are things. There's furniture, there's artwork, there's books, there's record albums. We all own those things, but none of them have deeds or titles or account numbers or anything that has to be re-registered if you give it to somebody else or transfer it to somebody else. For everything that does have a deed or title or account number, some of those have transfer mechanisms already built into them. So for instance, married couple owns your house together as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The first spouse passes away, it becomes the house of the survivor because you're joint tenants with right of survivorship. If you have an IRA that has beneficiaries designated, it's yours during your lifetime. It's under your Social Security number. You can do whatever you want with it. When you pass away, it transfers by virtue of that beneficiary designation to whoever you've named, whether it's your children or your spouse or your church or somebody else. However, if you have an IRA or an investment account or an asset that's in your name under your Social Security number and does not have a beneficiary or a transfer on death or a joint owner designation, when you pass away, there's nobody there to sign the documents that are needed to transfer that to somebody else. Basic example is a house. All property is owned by deed, or the record is by deed. I pass away, I can't sign a deed transferring it to you. And so there we need to open an estate, and an executor is appointed as the authorized representative of my estate, and then that person has the authority to sign that document to transfer that property, whether it's to sell it or to give it away to somebody else. So that's basically the difference between the terms of what you'll hear as probate assets and non-probate assets. Non-probate assets are those that transfer on their own. Probate assets are those that require an estate to be opened in order to transfer them. So a lot of the planning that people can do during their lifetime is to structure things so as much as possible they might be non-probate assets. With elderly people, as an example, a lot of times they will have sold their house, they will have moved to a facility, say Brethren Village or Willow Valley or Landis Homes, where they're now paying rent. They don't own real estate anymore. They have their assets set up in accounts that will transfer to a survivor. When they pass away, there might not be a need for an estate. Similarly, with married couples, my wife and I own everything together. We're on the deed to the house. We're both on the titles to our cars. She has her bank accounts that she uses, and I don't get into them, but I'm named on her bank accounts. I have my bank accounts. She doesn't get into mine, but she's named on my bank accounts. With married couples, quite often, with the first spouse to die, there's no reason to open an estate. It all just transfers to the surviving spouse. With the second to die, then there usually is a need to open an estate. The will then governs how assets are distributed out of an estate. So just yesterday, I had a client come in, and he's an engineer. He's none of you, so don't think I'm talking about you. He's an engineer, which meant he had all of his assets laid out on a spreadsheet, and he had a flow chart of, I die first, this is where it goes. She dies first, this is where it goes. And part of that was a fairly long list of charitable organizations that they wanted money to go to. In his mind, he's thinking, I've got whatever, $1 million, and this is where I want it to go. In fact, most of their assets are in IRA accounts that have beneficiaries designated to go to their children, which meant when they passed away, there would be very little that actually came into the estate, very little available for what he wanted to be specific bequests to their church, their school, their organizations, and there would be no cash available in the estate. So the will doesn't even touch those things that are non-probate assets that transfer otherwise. So basically, to set up a will, the first step, and the materials that you received when you came in, or if you're going to pick up afterwards, are wonderful because they go through sort of a thought process of asking you to look at what your assets are and see how they're held, where the accounts are, is there a joint owner or not. So to know what those things are and know what might come in through an estate when we set it up. A will then basically says, this is me, I'm married or I'm single, I have children or I don't, or we list out who our family members are, and then we say where we want our estate assets, our probate assets to go. We can have specific bequests that say, I want to leave $10,000 to St. John's and then the rest of it to go to my children. Or I could say I want 10% of it to go to St. John's and the rest of it to my children. Or we could name specific things. If there's a piece of artwork or jewelry or furniture that you want to make sure stays in the family and goes to a grandchild, you can do that. Or if there's a baseball card collection that Uncle Ernie always had his eye on. I'm always looking for somebody with a 65 Mustang convertible they want to leave to somebody. You can name that in the will, and then those are specific bequests. After that, everything is known as the residuary. And with the residuary, you decide or define where that goes. Quite often, it's either in equal shares to my children or equal shares to these people, or it's in percentages. And it might say 50% to this person and the other 50% is divided equally between these three people. As long as it comes up to 100%, we're in good shape. So we list out where things go and who they're going to. A quick diversion on that, or sideline on that, is if things are being left to children, then there are a couple different ways to do it. One is to leave things under what's called the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, which means that that asset or that dollar amount will go into an account in the child's name, naming an adult as the custodian for the account. And so it's the asset of the child, it's under the child's social security number, but minors can't control assets until they reach the age of majority. They can own assets, but they really can't control them. And so, and under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, the asset can be used for their benefit by the custodian, so pay for school expenses and food and clothing and all that. If there's anything left in the principle of it, it has to be distributed out to the child no later than their 25th birthday. And that's if something is left by within a will. If a gift is just made to a child under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, it has to be distributed to them by their 21st birthday. But under a will, it can last until 25. The other way of doing it is to put it into a trust. You name a trustee. That's typically preferred when the dollar amount is particularly large, or you know in advance that the child may not be able to manage those funds. With a trust, there's more complication involved. Once you establish the trust, it has its own ID number, it has its own tax returns, you have annual trust accounting that has to be done. With a custodial account, it's a bit simpler. So for relatively smaller amounts, and you know that it's going to go out to the children by their 25th birthday, then that's a more convenient way to go. So back to the workings of the will. The other key points typically are naming an executor. So I get to name who I would want to be able to handle my estate, should we need to open one. Very typically for married couples, each husband and wife name each other as the executor, and then you name an alternate in the event that your principal executor isn't there. Sometimes that's a child, sometimes it's a good friend. From my perspective as the attorney for the estate, I just want the executor to be somebody who's familiar with your affairs, who knows where you bank, who knows where you keep your records, knows if you have a safe deposit box or not, knows if you happen to have property out of state or a fishing cabin somewhere up north, just because we look to the executor to gather in that information. Similarly, along the lines of naming an executor, back to minor children, you can also designate who you would want to be a guardian for your child or your children should you pass away while they are minors. So in terms of wills and will preparation and planning, I think those are really the key points. I'd like to come back to the state administration side in just a little bit, but Penn, if you'd like to, at this time, talk a little bit about some of the things that we can do in our planning and financial management during our lifetime to possibly minimize the requirements or the effect for an estate. Freshly cleaned microphone for you.
Thank you, Brad. It's so good to see such a nice turnout here today. Can everybody hear me? All right. I just want to give you one word of caveat before I begin, that many of the things I say will only apply to people who have attained the age of 70 and one half. And as I look out on this group of faces, I can see that obviously nobody here fits into that category. But out in TV land, maybe there are some people who have. And I want to talk a little bit about charitable giving. And I thought it would be good to use as a hypothetical example. I was trying to think of, I don't know, a random charity that we could talk about. I don't know. How about St. John's Episcopal Church? There's a charity. Now let's say that you have prayerfully considered making a gift to St. John's Episcopal Church. And after careful review and prayer, you've decided that you want to give $2,000. And you have some options on where that money will come from. You could take it out of your bank account. You could sell a stock and use the proceeds of that. And you also have some IRAs lying around there. And if you've, depending on when you were born, either 70 and a half or 72 if you were born on or before July 1, 1949, you have something called required minimum distributions. They call them RMDs. Maybe you've heard that term floating around. Because Uncle Sam says if you have an IRA and you reach a certain age, and currently is 72, you have to make distributions based on an actuarial table. And the whole idea of an IRA, if you remember, you put the money in the first place and you got a tax deduction. And then the money sat in that account and was able to grow, sheltered from taxes. But then the time comes you want to take the money out. Well, guess what? Uncle Sam is going to say you have to pay tax on that as part of your income for that tax year. As long as you're 59 and a half, by the way, you can take that money out anytime you want. But the question is, should you? Because you're thinking about making this $2,000 gift. If you take it out of your bank account and write a check out of that and bring it over to St. John's, that's a great thing. But at the end of the year, when tax time comes, your tax preparer will probably tell you for 2020, that is, that if you've reached the age of 65, you have it's $27,000 some odd dollars for a married couple and half of that for an individual of a standard deduction. So that unless you have enough standard deductions to get over that threshold, for all intents and purposes, you can't really get any advantage out of the charitable deduction. So how can you give the money and have a tax benefit at the same time? Now, let's just say for the sake of discussion that you have an RMD, required minimum distribution, for 2020, well, actually it would be for 2021, of $2,000. So what you do is you talk to your trustee of your IRA and you give instructions and say, I want you to write a check to St. John's Episcopal Church for $2,000 out of my IRA account. And then you can either mail that check directly to St. John's or mail that check to me and I'll hand carry it over there. You don't want to take your money out of your IRA and then write your own check. That doesn't work. It has to be a check drawn from the IRA trustee. And if you do that, you've succeeded in doing two things. First of all, you've satisfied your required minimum distribution. It's called a qualified charitable distribution. And then secondly, you really are getting a tax benefit, because if you had just taken the money out of your IRA, you'd have that $2,000 more income to pay taxes on. This way, you don't have that. So you can sort of have your cake and eat it too. You can get the benefit of the standard deduction if that's beneficial for you, and get the benefit of the IRA distribution. Now, this is only available, as I mentioned earlier, to people who have reached the age of 70 and a half. And if you want, you can make a charitable distribution from your IRA over and above your required minimum distribution. It's not limited to that. The limit is $100,000 in a year. So that if you were fortunate enough to be able to make a gift of that size, you could give $100,000 and still get the benefit. Because eventually, when that money comes out, you'll have to pay tax on it. Now, I've been talking about as it pertains to lifetime gifts, and in other words, what I'm saying to you is, if possible, make your lifetime gifts out of your IRA, taking advantage of the qualified charitable distribution. That does not apply to 401ks. If you have a 401k, you don't have that same qualified charitable distribution. You can, however, roll a 401k into an IRA, although you won't be able to do that during the current year. You'll have to wait till the next tax year to do that. Now let's talk for a moment about gift giving in estate planning. And I know that Brad touched on the hypothetical situation of leaving a gift in your will. But what I would say to you, and this should not be constituted as legal advice, I'm doing the standard disclaimer or tax advice. I'm just giving you my opinion. But I think that whenever possible in your gift-giving part of estate planning, use IRAs for the gift. Because let's say you have an IRA that has $50,000 in it, and you either by designated beneficiary or by a gift in your will, you leave it to your child. And that's great. But first of all, if you're over the age of 59 and a half when you're making the gift, which you presumably would be, Pennsylvania will impose inheritance tax on the value of that IRA. If it's a lineal descendant, child, grandchild, et cetera, it'd be at the rate of 4.5%. And your beneficiary or heir, when he or she gets that money, when he or she takes the money out of that IRA, that will be income to that beneficiary, on which income he or she will have to pay tax. And there's a limit of how soon they have to do it. I think they have to take it all out within 5 years and so on and so forth. But whatever that is, the same basic concept applies. So in a sense, you could say it's a double tax. So if you're thinking about gift giving, and if you have a choice, I've got some IRAs, I've got some bank accounts, I've got some stocks and bonds, I've got real estate. What I would say to you is consider using your IRAs or 401ks for the charitable donations. Because the charity is, first of all, there's no inheritance tax on gifts to a charity. Secondly, when the charity receives the IRA and starts taking money out of it, the charity doesn't have to pay income tax. So it's a benefit both ways, and it definitely, I would say that look at exhausting all of your IRAs for charitable giving first, and then you can talk about the other assets. So that really is the main thing that I wanted to talk about. And again, the charitable gifts, they can either be lifetime gifts, they can be done under a will, they can be done under a named beneficiary, whichever way that you want to do it. So that's my tidbit for the morning, and I thank you for your attention. I'm going to turn the microphone back over to my friend Brad here.
Thank you, Penn. Several really key things that Penn talked about and raised one issue, and that's tax. But there are a lot of people that are always interested in avoiding tax or limiting tax. In Pennsylvania, there is state inheritance tax. Not every state has inheritance tax, which you may have figured out why most people on the East Coast move to Florida before they die. But Pennsylvania does. So we have both federal estate tax and Pennsylvania inheritance tax. Right now, federal estate tax only applies to that portion of estates that are over $11.7 million per person, and then there's portability with a married couple, so it takes it up to $23.5 million. With Pennsylvania inheritance tax, there is no exemption amount, so it starts from the first dollar, but the tax rate is different depending on who receives the proceeds of your estate, who the beneficiaries are. Between spouses, for married couples, the tax rate is 0. So there is no tax between from husband to wife or wife to husband. For lineal descendants, as Penn said, so children, grandchildren, if it were to go back up to parents, it's 4.5%. If you leave things to siblings, it's 12%, and everybody else is 15% except for charities, which don't pay, the estate doesn't pay any tax on bequests to charities. So a lot of times people will ask, or try to structure things so that they avoid the tax, that they pay as little tax as possible. One idea is to give things away during your lifetime, which works really well, but you have to give it away. Part of that, where it usually comes up, is with property. Somebody will talk about, well, I'd like to, everything's going to go to my daughter, and so if I put my daughter on the deed of my house now, then when I die, only half of the value of the house will be subject to inheritance tax because she'll already be the owner of the other half of it, which is accurate. There's one tax difficulty with that, and if you're familiar with capital gains, it's that if I give something away during my lifetime, if I give it to you, you take it at my basis. And not to get too complicated with this, but say there's something that I bought for $100 and now it's worth $1,000 and I give it to you, your basis is $100. You turn around and sell it for $1,000, you've got $900 of capital gain built into that. However, if I leave it to you in my will, you get what's called stepped up basis, meaning your basis is the fair market value on the date of my death. So on the date of my death, it's worth $1,000. You turn around and sell it the next day, you have no capital gain whatsoever. So what you're doing in adding somebody to a deed early on or giving it away is you're trading if it's a child or a lineal descendant, you're trading the 4.5% tax rate for the capital gain tax rate, which is quite a bit higher than 4.5%. Again, it's just, I think my point that for today's purposes at least, is to point out that it gets complex and you have to look at it from a lot of different perspectives. It's just not quite as easy as if I give it away. The other thing, so that you know, is under Pennsylvania law, anything given away within the 12 months prior to your date of death has to be included on the inheritance tax return. Now, none of us know when we're going to die, and the legislature didn't know when we were going to die, but the situation they imagined was, I'm very wealthy, I'm on my deathbed, I bring everybody around, I start signing things away and giving them away, I die 2 days later, and the state doesn't collect any inheritance tax. So the legislature just set a fairly arbitrary time frame of saying if you give it away within 12 months of your date of death, then we still get to collect inheritance tax on it. Which, by the way, several people, at least several clients, have always asked, why do we even have inheritance tax? The Pennsylvania Department of Revenue's official position is that it's a tax on the privilege of you transferring assets to somebody else. I'll just leave it at that. In a nutshell, the last thing to talk about, I think, is the estate administration side. And I'll start by saying the last thing in the world that we want to do is to have to open an estate to get a fairly small amount of assets or to be able to transfer a small amount, because it's complicated, it's somewhat expensive to open an estate. There are filing fees to pay with the petition to open the estate, and those are based on the value. Whenever we open an estate, we're required then to file an inheritance tax return with the Department of Revenue, whether there's any tax to be paid or not. And so, one of the things that Jeremy mentioned was prepaid funeral arrangements. Sometimes I'll prepay my funeral plan, and then when it comes time for it, the funeral actually costs less, and so there's a bit of a refund that may come back. If that refund under the insurance contract says it will pay into my estate, then my family can't get access to that unless I have an estate. So with the prepaid plan, if you can designate that any refund would be paid to my children, then it goes directly to them, and we don't have to open an estate. Sometimes the only asset that's out there might be a checking account. There's no real estate, any IRAs have beneficiaries designated, but there's a checking account that's just in Dad's name, and nobody can get access to that. There is an exception under the banking regulations that the bank can distribute out to immediate family members, meaning spouse, children, or siblings, up to $10,000 on presentment of a funeral bill. So if I have gone in and paid for my dad's funeral, and Jeremy gives me an invoice saying that I've paid $8,000 for my dad's funeral, I can take that to the bank and they will give me $8,000, up to $10,000 in my dad's account. If my dad had $13,000 in his bank account, there's no way I can get that additional money without opening an estate. To open an estate, it requires filing a petition with the Register of Wills. We can't do any of it until we get the death certificate. And Jeremy, or whatever funeral home you're working with, they're the ones that apply for and have the death certificates issued. So, oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Question.
I'm not sure you're on.
It kind of has a mind of its own, I think. I'll speak loudly. I'm hearing from a lot of families a situation like that where there's a refund, Brad, going back to the family. We want to avoid opening an estate. Just the funds are limited. It doesn't make sense to do so. I'm hearing that they can go to the courthouse and obtain a no estate affidavit, and that satisfies the legal requirements, but I'm hearing different responses from different attorneys. Are you familiar with this form, this no estate affidavit, and what is it? Does it work?
There's something called a small estate affidavit.
They're saying no estate.
Yeah, I don't know. Penn, do you know about no estate affidavit? Yeah. Yeah, and my concern is with a small estate affidavit, it's essentially the same process as opening the estate. So that's something I'll look into.
Okay,
because,
yeah. I'd love to know. Thanks.
Okay. I haven't run into that. So your family member dies, you go to the funeral home, you call our office or whatever attorney has the will and say, Dad just died, what do we do? The initial response is take care of the funeral, take care of the family, take care of yourself. There's nothing I can do until you get the death certificate, and that's probably going to be a week to 10 days or so. And so once you have the death certificate, then give me a call. Send me a scanned copy of it, because that gives me a lot of the demographic information we need for the petition. We'll have a phone conference where we figure out roughly the value of the assets that are going through the estate. Again, back to the probate and non-probate assets. I'm not going to be listing the IRAs or the joint property. I'm only listing things that will come through the estate. We file the petition with the Register of Wills, send a copy of the death certificate. If there's a will, we send a copy of that. If there's no will, then we indicate that there's no will, and we designate who the executor or the administrator is going to be. And then they schedule a conference where they review it with you, with me. It's a 5-minute process. They ask you if you've seen the petition, if you assert everything on there is accurate to the best of your knowledge, and will you administer the estate according to the laws of Pennsylvania. At that point, yes is a really good answer, and they'll say thank you, and I'm going to send you a notice, and then we've got an estate. They issue what are called short certificates, which is a piece of paper, and it's called a short certificate because it's about this size, that is the official, about this size, that is just a document that says an estate's been opened in the name of the decedent, and this is the name of the executor. And that's what the banks, the insurance companies, the financial brokers will all ask for and rely on to show that you, as the executor, have the authority to be getting the information that you're asking for. Beyond that, in a very small nutshell, the process of an estate is to gather in all the assets of the estate, to pay out any debts and liabilities of the estate. If there's cash in the estate sufficient, then the estate will be paying the inheritance tax before anything's distributed out to the beneficiaries. And then what's left is distributed out to the beneficiaries, either according to the terms of the will, or if there is no will, according to the terms of the state's intestacy statute, which, people are concerned, I need a will because I don't want all my assets to go to the state. It's a very long road before they end up going to the state. If you die without a will, if you're married, it just goes to your spouse. If you're not married and you have children, it goes to your children. If you are married and have children, then some of it goes to your spouse and some of it goes to your children. If you're married and have children, but the children are not the children of your spouse, then it's divided differently. They have all kinds of different scenarios that have been allowed for in that intestacy statute. So that's how the assets are distributed. The benefit of the will is to make sure that they're distributed the way you want them to. So if I'm married and have children from a prior marriage and we've separated our assets, and I want to make sure that my assets go to my children and her assets go to her children, then I better have a will that designates that. Otherwise, they're going to be commingled and mixed in between. In a nutshell, the timing for estate administration is somewhere about 9 to 12 months. The Department of Revenue likes to have the inheritance tax return filed within 9 months of the date of death. If we file and make an estimated payment on inheritance tax within 3 months of the date of death, then the Department of Revenue gives us a 5% discount on that payment. So we're always trying to do that, and that works really well when there's cash available in the estate. Sometimes there isn't. But in the long run, we try to get estates wrapped up within 9 to 12 months. Sometimes they take longer. If there's a lot of different real estate parcels out there that haven't sold yet or other settlements that need to be managed, then sometimes they take longer. But for the most part, I think 9 to 12 months is a good guide. I think that's about it. I mean, when clients come in, we do talk about powers of attorney and living will documents also. Those are covered in the materials, and we can certainly answer any questions, but I think rather than jumping into it, we'll just leave it open to questions. Okay?
Thank you, Brad.
Good.
There's a reason I don't do my own taxes, right? I'm not a tax accountant, and there's a reason I don't write my own will or figure this out on my own, because Brad and Penn are much smarter than I when it comes to this kind of work. Same with planning funerals, same with selecting funeral homes and going through that process. I want to keep going back to that idea that it takes a village. We do not live independently from one another, and we certainly do not die and pre-plan or plan for death independently. It takes a team. It takes a network of folks to do it faithfully, responsibly, and to make sure that our values are represented and we make the right decisions for those we love. All of this, and listen, I am not a legal-minded thinker. I like to do things and ask for forgiveness later. But in this, I know that's not a good idea. I've been told. This is a reminder. All of this past hour has been about there is more to death than dying. This is stewardship. You know, this church exists because of pre-planned funerals, bequests, planned giving. We ride on the saints who have gone before us every single year, over and over and over again. And the same applies for us. It's our turn. And I don't mean just the church, but I mean a community in and of itself. So there has been a lot of information sent out. I know I have my homework to do, but we want to open it up for questions. What are you guys thinking? What questions do you have? For those of you online, we've already gotten a couple questions here. Why don't we just start with that? This is a really good question and something I think Jeremy probably faces a lot, and I know I do. What advice can we give to hospice patients or family members when there's an unresponsive person or death is near and the family doesn't know where the plans are or if there are plans? Wills, accounts, pre-planned funerals. where do you look? Where do you go?
Sure, and that's a great question. And by no means do I want this to sound like a sales pitch by any stretch of the imagination, but that solidifies the importance of pre-planning. It does. Getting your wishes down in writing is so important. I can't tell you how difficult it is when I meet with a family. Mom passed away, there's 4 children, we sit down and all 4 children look at each other and shrug because they have no idea what mom would have wanted. It's tough. Where to look? Well, begin calling funeral homes to determine if they have pre-planned. Talk with clergy. Talk to Amanda, talk to the priest, talk to the preacher. Do you know what mom's wishes were? Begin asking other members of the family. Other than that, it's going to come down to the fact where the children are going to have to make some difficult decisions, hoping it's what mom would have wanted. But again, I'm kind of giving you a gray answer, but it's important to have that conversation before it gets to that point. And I tell families, they say, well, Jeremy, what's the right way to have a conversation about death and dying? And there is no right and wrong way. It's just important to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Whatever it means for you.
And knowing, do my parents have an attorney?
Yes.
Asking that information before it is too late. Is there paperwork? I'll never forget, when my own dad passed away, mom going through a file cabinet, just desperately looking for, did dad have something that I wasn't aware of, or where do we go? It's been so long, I forget. So keeping things up to date. But it really is, where's Waldo? Calling the funeral homes. The first thing that Aquila and I do when we get notified of a death is we have a file cabinet with all the pre-planned funeral documents in alphabetical, and we start looking, did they have anything? When they do, I breathe. When they don't, I say, okay, I'm going to be invited into a holy moment where we're going to figure this out from start to finish. Often, what is kept here, this is a confidential space. We keep everything locked, safe, and fireproof, everything. It'll be more than just the pre-planning of a funeral service. It'll also have contact information. So when I am able to pick up that phone and say, Sarah, your mom wanted to use X, Y, and Z. Here's the person you have to call and the number. The sigh of relief that I hear on the other side of that moment is godly. It is filled with love and filled with grace. So if you don't have that, and not just with a spouse, because let's face facts, or with a child, life changes. Things happen that you can't control. An outside third-party person to be able to get that information to me, is crucial.
Amanda, if I can jump in too.
Sure.
On that same point. As I mentioned with selecting or naming an executor, what's really helpful is to have somebody who knows what's going on in your life, to know where your files are, where you keep things. In terms of the legal documents, it's a common question that comes up. When we write wills, there's only one original will. Sometimes people will ask for, well, can I get 2 or 3 copies so I can give them to my children and all that? We can give copies, but when it comes time to opening the estate, we need the actual original will. At my firm, we keep all the originals in fireproof vault safe or files so that we know where they are. They are your documents. If you want them, you are allowed to take them. Certainly, you can keep them. You can put them in your own safe. Sometimes people put them in safe deposit boxes, but heaven forbid you don't lose the key to the safe deposit box. And so it is important to know where those things are. And from the planning side, that's exactly right. And everybody approaches it differently. Some people say, I don't even want to talk about it or think about it. It's not any of you because you're here this morning. On the other end of the extreme, I have friends who, her parents, every time they traveled, they gathered all the kids around and said, okay, this is where our will is, this is where our safe deposit box is, and they traveled 3 or 4 times a year, and it's like, Mom, Dad, come on, we know where these things are. So it's somewhere whatever's in your comfort level, but the key is to have good communication with those around you, with the family, or with your advisors.
And Brad, to just quickly to follow up, we tell families one of the worst places to keep your funeral pre-plans are in your safety deposit box. You can't access it until we have a death certificate, which oftentimes is 7 to 10 days following the death of the loved one. So don't keep your funeral plans in a safety deposit box. Keep it with your funeral home, with your loved ones, et cetera.
What other questions? Dave? And I'm going to repeat the question so it...
Just a couple of quick questions. One, how you just said something about a death certificate, and I guess it all depends upon the significance of the estate. But how many death certificates should?
Oh, good question.
That's a great question.
Provide? And I guess the answer is going to be you can't ever have too many.
Yeah.
Well,
the
right.
question is,
the-
how many
yeah.
death certificates should you have for all the end-of-life things that need to happen?
Right, from the...
Yeah,
it is. No,
good.
it's a great question. So how many death certificates should you get for a loved one who just passed away? And the answer is going to depend on where and how many different asset accounts there are. I will need a death certificate to open the estate, to file with the petition, and I'll need a second one to open the estate bank account. So I need 2 at least. And then if you have 2 bank accounts at 2 different banks and investment accounts at 2 or 3 different investment houses, we're going to need 1 death certificate for each of those institutions. Quite often, there will be others that ask for a death certificate, such as if you're canceling Dad's credit card, they're going to say, well, send me a death certificate. In that case, we always send scanned copies of the death certificate. Death certificates cost $10, $20
The
each?
state of Pennsylvania charges $20. They charge
$20 each. And so the rule of thumb in our office is if they're going to be sending us money, we'll send them an original death certificate. But if they're not sending us money, we're going to send them a scanned copy.
My answer is 10. Just 10.
I will say, when my father passed away, they needed a death certificate for Comcast cable.
Yeah,
Get his name on.
Yeah.
copies.
They said if you almost ordered 10 and then you need 20, it costs more.
So to clarify, that's a great point. The old rule of thumb was get a bunch now because they're hard to get later and they get more expensive. They used to be $6 per copy, and we'd have 30 days from the time a person passes away, at which point they went up to 20. Now, the state of Pennsylvania has increased the charge to $20, which is quite a jump, obviously, $6 to $20. But we now, on the positive, we have 90 days to get additional copies at that $20 mark. So we have 3 months. So I tell families, order what you know you need, knowing you can always come back and get more within 90 days.
And just to know that there are slightly different rules if the decedent's a veteran. Getting through the VA is a bit different.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brad. Yeah, Matt.
So, Jeremy, you mentioned some of the kind of fees that are not just the funeral planning, but then there are kind of additional costs. And Brad, you mentioned the same thing with opening an estate, and now fees with getting death certificates, with all these different fees that survivors may have to pay after the fact. Is there any way to roll some of that into like the pre-planning arrangements that I might do with Jeremy, maybe on top of, all the funeral arrangements, maybe put an additional $500 that would be set aside to cover those extra costs, and, my survivors don't have to worry about, all right, now I'm shelling out $120 for death certificates.
Can we repeat the question real quick?
Sure. The question was, can I add additional funds to my prepaid funeral account to cover some of the miscellaneous items, such as death certificates, an obituary, maybe a luncheon, things of that nature? Yeah, absolutely. I tell families, I advise them to, for lack of a better word, hedge high. So if you have the available funds to do so, put more in the account than you think you need, keeping in mind it goes back to the family if you don't use it. I'd highly suggest doing that.
Does that also apply for like the estate fees for opening an estate?
That's
You can
different.
touch on that, please.
Yeah, I haven't actually ever seen a prepaid account to handle the estate fees and the costs. What I will say, though, is that if the family is pressed to have the funeral and they haven't prepaid for the funeral and to have expenses that they incur, if there's money that will be coming into the estate account, all of those expenses are reimbursable to the person that pays them out of pocket. So again, if my dad died and there weren't prepaid funds, and I paid for the funeral, I paid for the luncheon, I paid for the filing fee for the petition for the estate and all of that, once the estate assets come in, I'll be reimbursed for those. It's not income to me. It actually reduces the amount of taxable inheritance or the taxable value of the estate. So the inheritance tax is reduced because of those expenses that are paid out. But sometimes it comes to that the assets of the decedent are fairly complex and they're hard to get to. They're hard to close out those accounts and get them into it. So the family, if they're available, if they're able to, they can pay them out of pocket and then get reimbursed.
Yeah.
Lately, just so that you know, lately that has mostly come up with that prepaid or estimated payment of inheritance tax 3 months from the date of death. And that's mostly because pre-pandemic days, the process would be dad died, you get the death certificate 10 days later, you come in to see me, we fill out the petition, we walk to the courthouse, we present it, and we have short certificates 2 days later. So within the first 2 weeks, we have those. Now, because the courthouse is closed to people walking in, they're doing everything by video conference. So you send it all into us. It's taking them a month or more to have the video conferences. Sometimes we're not getting the estate opened within 3 months of the date of death. And so we've had families, if they're able to make that estimated payment. We know what the estimated payment should be, but we don't even have the estate account opened yet. So we don't have mom or dad's assets in the estate account. If I have my own, I can make that payment, and then when mom or dad's assets come into the estate account, I'm reimbursed from that. And again, it's not a taxable event, but it's really causing complications because of the way the process is running right now.
Dave, or Dave and then Rosemary.
Are there any wrinkles that we should know about in relationship to retirement centers that have continuing medical facilities and so on in relationship basically to transfer of property? It's not an end of life situation, but it's a beginning to the end of life situation in terms of transfer of property.
So the question is, are there any wrinkles in retirement communities when beginning the end of life stages, moving on? I mean, I think the most important question is to ask the retirement community itself. My family just went through this. What happens to assets after the checking account runs out? Will you take claim of the house? Those questions have to be asked. But Brad, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I'm thinking of like 3 different perspectives of that. One is if I'm in a facility in a community and my resources run out, is there some sort of a fund that they'll keep me there? And quite a few of it's one of the wonderful things about Lancaster County is that quite a few of the facilities do have those funds as long as you have managed your resources prudently and you just outlive your resources, then they will always have a space for you. One of the things that I thought of while you were asking your question is that some of the facilities have different buy-in contracts so that you pay a certain amount when you go in and then you pay rent from there on out. Some of the contracts, if you pay more and you leave or die within a certain time period, then you get a refund from that buy-in amount. And I know some of the facilities will only pay that refund to an estate. They will not pay it to family members, in which case we have to open an estate in order to get that refund back.
Thank you, Brad. Rosemary.
I just had a question about paying those bills. Can the executor or executors pay bills from the deceased accounts?
Can we?
I was able to when I was the executrix for my former husband.
Okay.
Repeat
Yeah,
the
great question. So Rosemary's question was that if I'm the named executor of a family member's estate and that decedent had a bank account. Now, Rosemary, in your case, were you named on the bank account? No. Okay, so it was just his bank account. And can the executor use that bank account to pay bills or pay expenses? The short answer is no, you're not supposed to.
Shh, don't tell anybody.
This isn't being recorded, is it?
Yeah, it is.
The longer answer is that quite often now today, with online banking access, family members have access to the decedent's bank account. I always have to give them the advice that they're not supposed to be using that. Even if they were the agent under the power of attorney, their agent authority stops at the time of death of the principal person. So your agent authority doesn't apply anymore. But I do know, or I've heard stories that it happens out there sometimes. It's not supposed to happen.
Thank you, Brad. Other questions? Yeah, Erica.
When you're talking about pre-planning or prepaying, is that taking money out of your life insurance policy to you?
So the question. Yeah, it's a great question. So when it comes to prepaying for your funeral, there's a variety of ways of doing it. So we can take cash, and you can simply write a check. There's a prepayment, multi-payment process. We have families making as little as $25 a month here and there. That's what they can do. There's also the option of having, what's called irrevocably assigning a pre-existing life insurance policies, which I think is where you're going with that. So a lot of people have a life insurance policy, whether through an employer, whatever the case may be. We can assign the proceeds of the policy to the funeral home, meaning at the time of passing, the funds are paid directly to the funeral home to pay for funeral expenses. That's an irrevocable assignment, or irrevocable, again, depending on who's pronouncing it, meaning the policy is protected. So if you go to the Medicaid spend down process, you're depleting your assets, they're gonna find that insurance policy, and they're gonna try to have you cash that in. If you assign it to the funeral home, it's protected. So you can pay with an existing life insurance policy, and if it's assigned to the funeral home, there's asset protection there.
So what if you have a $100,000 life insurance policy and the funeral cost $8,000?
So there's county limits. So Lancaster County, and please don't quote me, I think it's about $15,000. So I'll never forget, a gentleman says, well, my goodness, Jeremy, I'll just put a couple $100,000 in this account. This is not a tax-free way of sheltering money, but you can only assign what's up to the county limits.
Yeah.
So yes.
And let me just tack onto that. I'm glad you mentioned life insurance and you talked about it a bit. Going back to inheritance tax, everybody's favorite subject. Anything that transfers to a beneficiary is subject to inheritance tax except for life insurance. So again, even if you have non-probate assets, you've named beneficiaries under your IRA, when that goes to your children, that is subject to inheritance tax. If you have put property into a trust, whether it's in any sort of revocable trust, lifetime trust, so that you have control over it during your lifetime, but then it passes to your children without having to go through an estate, it's still subject to inheritance tax. Life insurance benefits are the only thing that are not taxable for Pennsylvania inheritance tax purposes.
Thank you.
Kathy.
What's the benefit of having a revocable?
Say it again.
What's the
The-
benefit of having a revocable?
Right. The question is, what's the benefit of having a revocable trust? And I'll say that the probate process is different from state to state. In some states, it's a very cumbersome process. Honestly, from my perspective in Pennsylvania, it's not a very cumbersome process. The benefit of having a revocable trust is, and if you don't know, you transfer, you have a beach house and you deed it from yourself to the Brad Zook Revocable Trust, so the deed is there, and then under the trust document, I'm the settler, I put the property into it, I'm the trustee, I'm the lifetime beneficiary, but when I die, it becomes the property of my good friend Kathy or somebody else, so it just transfers that way. The benefit is that it transfers without having to open an estate, but it does not escape inheritance tax, and quite often, if there are other assets in there, and if the trust is going to continue on for some time after my death, then you end up with trust administration, which is essentially comparable to estate administration. So the worst thing in the world is, somebody gets the idea that I should put all my assets into a trust and I avoid probate. So they set up a trust, they put some of their assets in, but then they accumulate other assets in their lifetime that they don't put in their trust. And then when they die, we end up with both estate administration and trust administration, which is the last thing you want to do. So now in other states, I will say that it's probably more beneficial to put your assets into a trust so that you avoid the probate process. Like I said, I know that some in particular are really cumbersome and take a long time and very expensive. Pennsylvania's probate process is pretty streamlined.
So if your kids are named as beneficiary of all of your assets,
Right.
and you die, does that still have to go through probate?
Question was, if your children are named as beneficiaries on all your assets, do you still have to go through probate? No. If all of your assets will transfer, have some sort of transfer mechanism built into them, then they just transfer by virtue of that mechanism, and you don't need an estate. So if I have bank accounts, say I have money in CDs, and those CDs are designated as transfer on death to my children. I have bank accounts that are designated as pay on death to my children. I have IRAs, but I also have a house that's in my name that we will need an estate for that house, but we won't need an estate for all those other assets because they all transfer.
Will they get hit with the 4.5%?
Yes. The question was, will they get hit with the 4.5% tax? Yes. Everything that has a transfer mechanism, all non-probate assets are subject to inheritance tax except for life insurance proceeds. So that IRA that you've got $100,000 in and you've named your children as the beneficiaries, that will transfer to them without an estate, but it is subject to inheritance tax. Quite often, we have estates that have both probate assets and non-probate assets. So there's the IRA that transfers outside the estate, but there's the real estate that has to be sold and going through the estate. If it's possible that if there's enough cash in the estate account to cover the inheritance tax on all of the assets, then we do that. But occasionally there isn't. If all of your assets are non-probate and they just all go to your children without an estate being opened, then the obligation to pay the inheritance tax is going to fall on your children to work directly with Department of Revenue to pay that.
Can you set up a separate account just to cover those, any of the taxes that could occur?
The question was, can you set up a separate account to cover those taxes? Absolutely. And that's part of that planning process to make sure that, just as Dave was asking, or Matt, I think, can you designate funds to cover those ancillary expenses? Yes, you could have a separate account that, and it could be a CD or a savings account that is designated to go to the children. That's ready cash. They don't have to do anything to convert it. They get the cash and use that to pay the inheritance tax.
Excellent. Friends, we're at 11:40.
Oh my gosh.
Good Lord, I love you guys for faithful living and also the discussion about faithful dying. This is wow. I want to take one final question if you have it, and then offer just a final word. This is the first of many conversations that we should be having as a community of faith. This is just the opening teaser with lots of information to look through, but more importantly, lots of things to pray about and to discuss with the people that you will love both in this life and in the life to come. So, Erica, you have the final question? Make it good.
It's about children. So, at what age do you not need a guardian in your will for your child?
Great question. The question is, with children, at what age do you not need a guardian? In Pennsylvania, the age of majority is 18.
Okay, so when they're 18, like my children are pretty close in age, is there somebody then that can help them? Like I'm thinking, my son will be 18 next year, he's the youngest. Say for some reason that we both die in the next 3 years. They're very young to be able to take care. Do you put something in your will as, I don't want to call it a guardian, but somebody that would help them?
Question is, if you have a child who's 18 or close to 18, but would still need some assistance for the next few years, can you put that in your will? As I mentioned earlier, with leaving bequests to minors under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, it does not have to end at 18. So you could leave it to them and say, any child of mine that's under the age of 21, this will go into a UTMA custodial account to be managed by this person, the adult, and then distributed out to them no later than their 25th birthday. So you can set it up that way. It's a great question.
I think of godparents and guardians that would play a role in that for sure. Wow. I got some homework to do. I don't know about the rest
I
of
got more questions.
I know, I have so many more questions too. However, here's what you need to know. There are resources available to continue these conversations. Jeremy has already offered, of course, Matt said he would take care of all the funeral planning at St. John's. Matt and I both would be more than happy to look at that side of things. I know Penn and Brad as well. There are attorneys. There are plenty of different funeral homes. There are lots of clergy. Choose Matt outside of that. Just know that there are resources available. And if you need help connecting to those resources, call us and we'll get you a list of names. Here are folks that you can call. Here are some recommendations that we have so that you can have these one-on-one conversations to talk about your specific individual discernment when it comes to all this. Another thing briefly I want to say is we all know coming into this world is not cheap, right? When I had my 2 kids, I could not believe the hospital bill that I saw. The reality is leaving this world is not cheap either. And I know that's really difficult for so many families that haven't pre-planned and don't have the resources to put towards prepaying and pre-planning. But begin having those conversations. Begin the conversation of where do you want to be laid to rest? We have a memorial garden that costs $500. We have a beautiful columbarium that's $3,000 that you can be laid. There are cemeteries. There are spreading of ashes. You know, I told John when I go to my 3 favorite camps, my 3 churches, throw my ashes in the air and say a prayer and sing a song. You know, have these conversations, but to be able to tell your family, for me to be able to say, listen, this place meant something to your mom. And she's got a niche right next to her best friend who has a niche. Or I'm going to lay your dad in this cemetery because his parents are there. Or, you know, because it has some kind of meaning. That is good news, gospel good news. To walk with people through that and to be able to give them that information. Like Jeremy said, it begins that healing process to be able to do that. You are giving a gift to people that you love beyond the grave. If that isn't Jesus, I don't know what else is. Matt, you had one more thing to say?
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the benefits to today is that with all the information that we've been given, streaming it on YouTube gives us a resource that we can go back to and review some of the responses that Brad and Jeremy and Ken have given. So if you are like me and you're a little overwhelmed at all the things that you need to think about, please do check YouTube, our YouTube channel. All of this is recorded for our benefit as we continue to think about how we're going to handle these moments that are not always easy to think about.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much for setting this all up.
Well,
As recipients of this information, making sure that we have all our I's dotted and T's crossed, and knowing that we need to do some things or we are on the right track. Hey, thanks so much. I know I'm greatly appreciative of the effort, all four of you up there that have been doing this.
amen.
Thanks so much.
You are so welcome. And Rosemary with the Stewardship Committee and Capital Campaign, I mean, the creativity and the thoughtfulness in this parish, not just as we live, but as we die, it's incredibly humbling. And to say that the Spirit is alive and moving through this place would be understated. So you have a dream team here, guys, so please utilize them and continue the conversation. Amen? Rosemary?
I just want to make one comment, and I think this is all very serious. This is a little levity here. The whole theme as this went through of all this wonderful information, what I noticed was a little bit, some of us like to be in control of things, control of our lives, just in control. And everything we talked about today puts us in control of how we want things to be. And these are tips on how to get there.
Yeah.
I just felt that this was really informative.
Good.
Taking charge of your own
Absolutely.
destinies.
I mean, again, it's just a testimony to the faith that dwells within. We want to be as conscientious about how we're living. We should do the same with dying and what we leave behind. The legacy that we leave and the love that we share. It knows no time and no space, so let's prove it, right, to those we love. With that being said, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Alleluia, alleluia.